Ever imagine being in a room full of people and every face is just stuck in this silent stream?
I can't say I have.
Well, that's how Thomas De Quincey described these like opium-induced hallucinations he was having.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like a very good time.
Not a party at all.
No. More like a glimpse, I guess, into the dark side of what we could call the romantic imagination.
So is that what we're looking at today, the romantic imagination?
Well, De Quincey wasn't alone in having these kind of unsettling visions. Back then, opium was pretty common as a medical treatment in the 19th century.
Right.
But it had a big effect on a lot of English authors.
Yeah.
Especially those that we now think of as like the giants of the Romantic era.
So we're diving into the world of opium dreams and these masterpieces of literature.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, we're going to be exploring the connection between creativity and mental illness, how these intense hallucinations that opium brought on actually shaped the work of 4 authors.
Who are we talking about here?
Thomas De Quincey, who we just mentioned, George Crabbe, Francis Thompson, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge.
Okay, so these are big names, and they're all using opium, essentially, as like their muse.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that, but remember, it was supposed to be medicine, right?
Right.
But these authors in particular, they experienced a much darker side, I guess, to the drug. And their writing is full of these really vivid, often terrifying descriptions of hallucinations. And these weren't just fleeting nightmares. They really blurred the lines, I think, between dream and reality. And they definitely had a lasting impact on their work.
Okay, so it's more than just like, oh, I had a bad dream and now I'm writing it down.
Mm-hmm.
This is something deeper.
Exactly.
So let's get into the specifics then. Like, how did opium actually like affect their writing? Did they just start like scribbling down all their drug-fueled ramblings?
Yeah. No, not exactly. While it definitely influenced their work, they were really deliberate in how they incorporated these elements. They used them as raw material, and they crafted these really intricate plots and explored all these complex psychological themes. It's more like they transformed these dark experiences into art.
Okay, I like that.
Right.
Transforming it into art.
Yeah.
So do you have an example of that transformation for us?
Sure. Let's look at George Crabbe for a second.
Oh.
He struggled with opium addiction, and he wrote this poem, Sir Eustace Grey.
Okay.
And in this poem, the structure and the language changes dramatically compared to his other works.
Oh, wow.
It's almost as if the poem itself is mirroring the fragmented and disorienting nature of his opium visions.
So the poem's form is actually reflecting the experience of the drug.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
What about the content, though? What are they writing about? Was it all just doom and gloom?
Well, a lot of it was. Like, think about De Quincey's account of being tormented by this Malay figure in Confessions of an English Opium Eater.
Or Crabbe's description of these Gothic halls filled with silent kings from the world of dreams. The theme of persecution and horror is a pretty big one.
So not exactly light reading. But it sounds like these authors were tapping into something kind of profound, even if it was through the lens of opium.
Yeah, exactly. And these visions weren't just scary. They often distorted their sense of time and space, too.
Really?
Yeah, like De Quincey wrote about feeling like he had lived for centuries in just one night.
Wow.
And Crabbe, in that same poem, The World of Dreams, he talks about this, that sad, last, long, endless day.
So it's like time became elastic. I think we can all kind of relate to that feeling of time stretching out. What about space, though? Did they experience anything like that?
Absolutely. I mean, they describe rooms transforming into these vast caverns and lakes becoming boundless oceans. It's as if opium allowed them to just transcend the limits of our normal perception.
That's kind of unsettling, but also like amazing. So
Yeah.
were all of their works that were influenced by opium kind of dark and distorted feeling?
Not all of them. Coleridge's Kubla Khan is a really interesting example.
What's special about that one?
Well, it's said to have been composed entirely in an opium dream.
Wait, so he literally dreamt the whole poem?
That's what he said. He describes falling asleep after taking opium and reading this passage about Kubla Khan and then composing the poem in a dream.
That's wild. So how is it different from these other works that we've been talking about?
Unlike the horrifying visions that haunted a lot of these authors, Kubla Khan focuses on the beauty and the sense of wonder that opium could evoke.
So instead of darkness and terror, Kubla Khan represents the kind of ecstatic side of opium.
Exactly. The poem captures that swift, kaleidoscopic nature of those visions, filled with these shifting landscapes and fluctuating style. It's almost like a glimpse into the creative subconscious, unfiltered by conscious thought.
It just seems paradoxical that the same drug could inspire both terrifying hallucinations and a poem that is as beautiful as Kubla Khan.
It is a paradox. It highlights that complex and unpredictable relationship between opium and the creative process.
So we've talked about distorted time and space, visions of horror, and then these moments of pure creative inspiration, all fueled by opium. But this milk of paradise, didn't it come at a price?
It absolutely did. You can't ignore the negative consequences of addiction. Coleridge, for example, he experienced a decline in his work as his opium use got worse. And De Quincey's Confessions, despite its moments of brilliance, is ultimately a cautionary tale about the destructive power of addiction.
So are we supposed to see these authors as tragic figures sacrificing their well-being for their art?
I think it's more nuanced than that. I think their lives and their works remind us that creativity doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's all intertwined with personal struggles, pressures from society, and even the way our brains work. Their stories are definitely cautionary, yes, but they also offer a lot of insight into the creative process.
So how do we reconcile the beauty of their work with this darkness of their addiction?
Well, we can start by examining how they harness the power of their experiences. Remember, they weren't just passive observers of their hallucinations, they were actively shaping them into art.
Okay, so how did they do that? Did they have any specific techniques they were using?
One that really stands out is their use of vivid imagery and sensory detail. They were masters of language, and they used it to create a sense of immediacy and pull readers directly into those opium-induced experiences.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's take this passage from Francis Thompson's Finis Coronat Opus. He writes, "Silence now, at least, abysmal silence. Except the sound, or is the sound in me, the sound of dripping blood, except that the flame upon the altar sputters and hisses and bickers as if it licked its jaws."
Wow, that's intense. I can almost hear the dripping blood and the crackling flames.
Exactly. Thompson's use of these vivid sensory details creates this heightened reality, immersing the reader in the protagonist's state of mind. He's not just telling us about the hallucination, he's making us feel it.
It's like he's bridging the gap between his personal experience and the reader's imagination just through language.
Precisely. And you see similar techniques in Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, particularly in those chilling descriptions of the rotting sea and the spectral figures that are tormenting the mariner. The imagery is so vivid you can practically smell the decay and feel the terror.
Speaking of the Ancient Mariner, didn't Coleridge also play with our perception of time in that poem?
He did. These authors often used language to create a sense of disorientation to mirror the psychological effects of opium. They'd play with syntax, use repetition, and craft these long flowing sentences that mimic the feeling of time stretching out endlessly.
That reminds me of something De Quincey wrote in Confessions about how time seemed to both expand and contract under the influence of opium. He describes experiencing entire centuries in a single night, but also feeling trapped in a single terrifying now.
That's a great example. It's as if opium allowed them to experience time in a completely different dimension.
So they were using language to capture those altered states of consciousness, to translate the experience of an opium dream into something that readers could actually grasp.
Yeah, and in doing so, they produce these incredible literary works that explore the depths of human consciousness in ways that wouldn't be possible without their experiences with opium.
So it's not about glorifying drug use, but about understanding how these authors transcended their struggles to create something truly unique.
That's a good way to put it. It's about recognizing the power of the human spirit to find meaning and beauty even in the darkest of experiences.
Speaking of finding meaning, we've talked a lot about the darker side of opium use. But didn't Coleridge describe composing Kubla Khan as a purely pleasurable experience?
He did. And that brings us back to that paradox of opium. It could inspire terror and despair, but also moments of pure creative ecstasy.
So in a way, Kubla Khan serves as a counterpoint to the more disturbing visions we've talked about. It represents the lighter side of opium's influence on creativity.
Yeah, you could say that. It's a testament to the drug's ability to unlock that hidden creative potential, to tap into a stream of consciousness that's normally inaccessible.
But we do have to remember that this creative outpouring came at a cost. These authors wrestled with addiction, and it ultimately took a toll on their lives and their work.
That's an important point. Their stories highlight the double-edged sword of creative inspiration. We can appreciate their genius, but we shouldn't romanticize their struggles.
Right. So how do we make sense of their legacy? Should we separate the art from the artist?
I don't think it's that simple. I think we need to engage with both the beauty of their work and the darkness of their lives to recognize the complexities of their experiences and the enduring power of their art.
Their stories raise some important questions about the creative process itself, don't they? Like, do you need to suffer to create great art? Is there some kind of inherent link between mental illness and creative genius?
Those are questions that have been debated for centuries, and I don't think there are any easy answers. Plenty of artists throughout history have produced masterpieces without enduring the hardships these authors faced.
That's true. But there's no denying that those who have faced hardship, whether it's addiction, mental illness, or other forms of suffering, they often bring a unique perspective to their art. It's as if they've glimpsed a reality that most of us can only imagine.
Absolutely, and that's what makes their work so compelling. They force us to confront the darker aspects of human experience.
So it's not about glorifying suffering, but acknowledging its impact on the creative process. These authors, in a way, acted as pioneers, exploring these uncharted territories of consciousness and bringing back those insights through their art.
And that's a valuable contribution, even if we can't condone the methods they used to get there.
It's a reminder that creativity can flourish in the most unexpected places. And even in the face of adversity, the human spirit can find ways to express itself.
Speaking of adversity, we focused a lot on the role of opium in shaping these authors' work. But it's important to remember that they were also dealing with other personal and societal pressures.
That's true. De Quincey, for instance, was haunted by his experiences as a child runaway. And Coleridge struggled with feelings of inadequacy and guilt throughout his life.
Exactly. Opium wasn't the sole source of their creative inspiration. It was one factor among many.
It's like opium acted as a catalyst, amplifying their anxieties and obsessions and pushing them to explore those themes in their work.
That's a good way to look at it. It's like the drug allowed them to access these hidden depths within themselves.
And through their writing, they were able to give voice to those experiences and shape them into something meaningful.
Precisely. And that's what separates them from countless others who succumb to addiction without producing anything of lasting value.
So it wasn't just the opium. It was their talent, their sensitivity, and their ability to transform their struggles into art.
Exactly. They were able to harness the power of their experiences and channel it into something creative, something that transcends the limitations of their personal lives.
So as we kind of reach the end of our exploration into the lives and works of these mad geniuses, what's the key takeaway you want our listeners to ponder?
I think it's important to remember that the relationship between creativity and mental illness is complex and multifaceted. It's not about romanticizing suffering or glorifying drug use.
Right. It's not about saying that you need to be tortured to be an artist.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the diversity of human experience and appreciating the unique ways in which artists throughout history have channeled their personal struggles into works that enrich our understanding of the world and ourselves.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this episode of The Deep Dive. I hope you found it insightful.
It was my pleasure. And if this conversation has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to delve deeper into the lives and works of these fascinating authors. You might be surprised by what you discover.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep creating.
And remember, even in the depths of despair, there's always the potential for beauty and inspiration. Sometimes you just have to dig a little deeper to find it.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to think that these authors were like wrestling with these huge existential questions,
Right.
while also dealing with the very real physical effects of opium addiction.
Yeah, it's a reminder that the creative process isn't always pretty, right? It can be messy and chaotic, even destructive sometimes.
But it's also within those messy spaces that you can find that true brilliance.
And they didn't shy away from the darkness either.
No, they didn't.
They leaned into it and explored it
Yeah.
and ultimately turned it into art.
Exactly. Think about De Quincey's Confessions. It's this raw account of his descent into addiction, but it's also a masterpiece of self-reflection and literary artistry.
And he was writing about addiction at a time when it was so misunderstood and stigmatized.
Yeah.
So he was shining a light on this dark corner of human experience. Yeah, and in doing so, he helped pave the way for, I think, a more compassionate understanding of mental illness.
That's a great point.
These authors, in their own way, they were challenging those societal norms and pushing the boundaries of what you could even talk about in literature.
They weren't afraid to delve into the shadows.
Right, and that's what makes their work so relevant even today.
And it's not just what they were writing about.
Yeah.
It's how they were writing.
Exactly.
That style, the language, the way they could evoke these intense emotions.
They were true innovators.
Yeah.
Pushing the boundaries of language and form.
Like Coleridge's Kubla Khan.
Right, yeah.
It breaks from all those traditional poetic structures.
Yeah, it's fragmented or
Dreamlike.
almost hallucinatory.
And that style reflects those altered states of consciousness that opium caused.
Exactly. They were experimenting with language in a way that mirrored their own perceptions.
So it's like opium gave them a different way of seeing and experiencing the world, and they translated that into art.
That's a great way to put it. They were tapping into something beyond ordinary experience.
And they shared it with us.
Yeah.
And they left behind this legacy that we are still inspired by.
Absolutely. Their stories remind us that you can find creativity in the most unexpected places.
And that even the darkest experiences can become something beautiful and meaningful.
Exactly. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive
into the Mad Genius Thesis.
It's been fascinating.
It has been.
And I hope everyone listening will continue to explore the works of these authors and engage with the questions that they raise.
Keep those questions in mind as you read literature and look at art.
Yeah.
You might be surprised by what you learn about creativity and just the human condition.
And always remember, even in the depths of despair, there's always the potential for beauty and inspiration.
Yeah, sometimes you just have to dig a little deeper.
Exactly.
Thank you for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure.
And until next time, keep exploring and keep creating.
Yeah.
It's interesting to think about how these authors were dealing with these huge questions while also physically going through opium addiction.
Yeah. It really is a powerful reminder that creating something isn't always, pretty or easy.
Right.
It can be chaotic, even destructive sometimes.
But within all that mess, you find the brilliance.
Exactly.
And they didn't shy away from any of it.
No, they really leaned into the darkness.
Yeah.
Explored it and transformed it.
Like De Quincey's Confessions.
Right.
He's just laying it all out there.
It's raw and unflinching, but it's also a masterpiece.
And what's really amazing is that he's writing about addiction when it was so taboo.
Exactly.
He was bringing it to light and maybe even help people to be more compassionate about mental illness.
Yeah, you could say that. These authors were challenging what was normal for society and pushing the boundaries of what you could even talk about.
They weren't afraid to get into the dark stuff.
And that's what makes their work still relevant.
Right.
And it's not just what they were writing about. It's how they did it.
Yeah, that style.
The language.
The way they could make you feel those emotions so strongly.
They were innovators, pushing the limits of language and the way they wrote.
Like how Kubla Khan is structured so differently.
Yeah.
It's dreamlike, and the imagery is almost like a hallucination.
Right, and that style reflects what they were going through.
It's like the opium let them see the world in a whole new way, and then they turn that into art.
That's a great way to put it. They tapped into something most of us don't experience, and they shared it with us.
And that is a huge legacy to leave behind.
It really is. It reminds us that creativity can be found anywhere, and even in the darkest times, beauty and meaning can come through.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Mad Genius Thesis, I just want to say thank you for joining us today. It's been a really fascinating journey for me.
It has been for me too, and I really hope our listeners will continue to explore these authors and the questions they raise.
Yes, keep thinking about these things as you experience art and literature. You never know what you might discover.
And don't forget, even in the toughest times, beauty and inspiration are always possible. Sometimes you just have to look a little harder for it.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep exploring and keep creating.